Jesus in the gospel this evening is rather direct and in some ways angry as he says, if someone was to lead a little one into sin, it'd be better for a millstone, a big old millstone, to be placed around his neck and for him to be thrown in the depths of the sea. Those are very strong words on the part of Jesus. Jesus can be rather confrontive. I remember visiting with a woman one time who said to me, you know, Father, Jesus wasn't always very nice. And I said, you know, you're right. Jesus wasn't always nice. Jesus could be rather offensive sometimes. He could be rather challenging. You think of when he went in and drove the money changers out of the temple, or when he confronted the Pharisees and their hypocrisy, the religious leaders, and he challenged them very, very strongly. And we would say, no, Jesus was not very nice. But he always acted out of love. It was always out of love. It was truth expressed in love. And that was the important thing. And that's the important thing for us to always realize, that yes, Jesus can be challenging. And this gospel this evening and this homily is not a feel-good one. It's not one you're going to walk away from here and say, oh, that made me feel so good, Father. I won't hear that from anybody as you leave tonight. Because Jesus does challenge us. He challenges us because he wants us to avoid hell. That's Gehenna. Gehenna was actually the city dump. And it was always smoldering. It was always on fire. And was seen as the symbol of hell in the time of Jesus. And Jesus saying, I don't want you to go to hell. I want you to go to heaven. That's what it's about. I'm reminded of a priest of our diocese who's now deceased and who will remain unnamed. But that priest always used to preach fire and brimstone. And his people sometimes had difficulty with that, and they were challenged by it. And he wasn't particularly popular in his parish. But I'll never forget one of his parishioners, a relatively young man, probably in his 30s at the time, said, you know what? We always knew that Father had one thing in mind, and that was he wanted each and every one of us to get to heaven. That was his purpose. That was his message. That's what he tried to accomplish. And that's what Jesus is doing in the gospel today. When he says, if your hand is your problem, chop it off. If your foot is your problem, cut it off. If your eye is your problem, pluck it out. Obviously, my hand is not my problem. My foot is not my problem. My eye is not my problem. It's what I may do with those things. And so Jesus there is really using what is called a Semitic hyperbole, where there's a physical exaggeration in order to get a moral point across. And so he's saying, take a look at your life, and not just on the surface, but go deeper. What is the cause of your sin? What is the underlying thing that causes you to offend God, to offend others, to compromise your very self? That's what he's getting at. He's saying we should go beyond the surface. I think sometimes, and obviously we should all be going to the sacrament of reconciliation regularly, but sometimes when we examine our conscience, it's somewhat superficial. It's kind of, well, I lied 3 times, and I criticized some people, and I yelled at my kids, and, that type of thing. But what we need to do is go below that and say, why did I lie? Why was I so critical? Why was I so envious? What was the origin of that? Because that's what we have to get to, is to the root of our sin rather than just the sin itself. And obviously, the 7 deadly sins ultimately express it for all of us. Pride, envy, jealousy, lust, sloth. all of those sins. Ultimately kind of express that. But even there, we need to even go deeper. We don't do wrong because it's wrong. We do wrong because we see a good within it. But it's a misguided good. It's a misfounded good. A lot of times, we're really trying to satisfy a very legitimate need, but we're satisfying it in the wrong way. We're satisfying it through negativity rather than through positive action. Jesus challenges us to get in tune, in touch with our deeper self and the deeper motivations of our actions. And he challenges us really to practice virtue. The best way to grow against an evil, a sin, is to consciously practice the opposite virtue. And every one of the 7 deadly sins has an opposite virtue. And that's what we are called to practice, is that opposite virtue. To live with a sense of humility, to live with a sense of gratitude, of living with a sense of forgiveness, of living with a sense of spiritual zeal, of living with a sense of compassion, with appreciation for the blessings that others have, as well as our own. That those are the qualities, just some of which, those virtues to which we are called. In our spiritual life, we should all pick one virtue that we feel God is calling us to grow in. Just one. The saints have often said, if you acquire one virtue a year, you will soon be holy. Sometimes we try to do too much, but to focus it upon just one virtue that will challenge us, one virtue that will enable us to grow stronger, to be more Christ-like within our life, to truly grow in that relationship with God, with others, and yes, with ourselves, to have that greater integrity of life. Jesus is not always nice, but he's always loving. And he continually calls us to grow in love, in truth, to be able to become ever more fully alive with his life, of putting aside the negative, the sinful, and embracing that life of virtue by which we put on the mind and the heart of Christ Jesus and come ultimately to share not in the fires of Gehenna, but in the joy of heaven.